Welcome to Rock That Relationship, a podcast about all things relationship with Corey and Tracy.
Now let's get real and start creating relationships that rock.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rock That Relationship. We are so excited. Again, we're excited every episode. See, every episode is just so cool. We get to talk to the most amazing people. We have yet another amazing person on the show today, Dr. Kristen Donnelly, who's going to talk with us about empathy and emotional intelligence in relationships. Because, you know, as we've been talking about so far, this whole season is about thriving in relationships. And how can we thrive? We can thrive through empathy and emotional intelligence. So let's get right to it, Kristen. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for asking me. It's an honor.
Well, wonderful. Maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do, how you got into what you do. Just kind of give us a backstory.
Sure. I grew up in the Philadelphia area. I claim Philly as home and have forever. We moved here as a family when I was very, very young so that my father could buy a failing manufacturing place. And it primarily manufactured, and still does to this day, dyes and colorants for products you've used all the time in the pharmaceutical industry. And I bring this up in particular because it really did shape why I do this work. So when I was growing up, it's a city that is in a really under-resourced section of the city. Our factory is in a part of Philadelphia that I think a lot of Philadelphia would like to pretend doesn't exist. And we are intentionally here so that jobs can happen here and growth can happen here and we can be present here. And it was an intentional decision for my parents to buy this place and turn it into what it is today, which is now a network of companies that my brother and I have taken over. And the whole network exists to impact lives and create holistic wealth. And holistic wealth means emotional and spiritual and sure, economic and financial and all that stuff. But how can we help the people that we know be the best versions of themselves? And I've been marinating in that question since I was 7. And my parents have asked me very intentional questions throughout my life to make sure that I was constantly focusing on the fact that how I was a human being is not the only way to be a human being. And so I was very fortunate to have that for a long time. All my education is people-based, adolescent psychology, anthropology, social work, and sociology. So all of it is about how do people kind of come together. When I finished my doctorate in 2015, and I was living in Northern Ireland at the time, and my brother and I were in talks to kind of take over this network. And he asked if I would move home and help him do it. Doing it over Zoom was getting a little bit exhausting. So I moved back to the Philadelphia area with my husband, who I met in Northern Ireland. And what it eventually came down to is after a lot of conversations, we decided that the best way for me to serve that mission to impact lives would be to create a division within the company that teaches what we've been practicing and doing all along. That teaches people how to know themselves better, to know each other better, to get along in a more cohesive manner, and learn from some of our corporate and family mistakes and kind of move on from there. And so once that happened, I hired my best friend that I met during my doctorate. Her name is Dr. Erin Hinson. And we've been doing that work together, the education and training and research bit, since 2017.
Wow. Okay. All right. There's so much in there. It's unreal. It seems like there's so much like, you're like a New Yorker story, you know, where you pick up and you're like, oh, dyes for pharmaceuticals. I don't want to read this article. And then you read it and there's like 12 layers of stuff that you never even thought about. Right. And you're like, God, that was the most interesting article I've ever read. And there's so much in there. Number one, like Northern Ireland. I mean, that's a place that's been full of conflict, right? And yet now is not in a place of conflict. And Philly and manufacturing, like that's kind of been at the forefront in the last presidential election and all of that stuff. And like, what does it mean to be in community? And then we're talking about relationships. So there's like so many different layers of relationships. So like, do you feel like because your parents, they imbued you with so much of that discussion about people? I mean, Do you feel like you were drawn to that, or this is something that you were like, you said you're become bathed in it from the time you were 7?
Yeah, I mean, like chicken or the egg, really?
Yeah.
I don't remember a time in which I wasn't taught to care about other people. I mean, and we come from a faith tradition where that's a really core part of our faith expression as a family, for sure. But also, I think just how my parents are wired, like they are the people that try to live their lives that everyone else is better around them, and that was very, very impactful, especially when I was in relationship with people whose parents didn't believe that and didn't act like that. And those were not the values that some of my friends' parents and families had. The more I saw the contrast, the more I realized a couple things, which is that none of it is seeing the world like that as a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a choice that can be extended to any living person. And so therefore, my responsibility is to live with it so well and to believe it so well that it might be attractive to others.
That's so interesting and so admirable. And this is kind of along the same lines, pickleball last night, where I told a guy who I work at this pickleball club and then I play there, for fun. And he works there and he's always razzing me. And I just don't like that kind of dynamic. And I said, look, I don't like it. I don't like how you talk to me. I don't like this. We'll get along a lot better if you can just respect that, that it just doesn't work for me. Right. And then later and he was respectful of that. And then later we were playing and there's a really like bubbly, friendly girl. And a guy told her, stop complimenting everybody. And later I texted her and I said, keep complimenting people, keep being the fun person you are. Don't turn into this, unfriendly person. And I thought at one point during the game, I almost said, why don't we just all compliment each other? Like, wouldn't that make everything better, right? And I think this translates to relationships too, which, I'm self-admitted, I have not been very good at that in my life. I did not have good modeling. And, it's so interesting because you saw this from being a young person, but it resonated with you, and then you've turned around and done that. And every level, I think people forget, versus your relationship with your parents, and relationship with a partner, relationship with friends, relationship with the world, relationship with, we don't think of manufacturing as who cares, right? But it makes a huge impact, right? That's jobs in a community, which then, you read about these manufacturing places that went out of business and the whole town fell apart. So kudos to you for doing that work.
Oh, well, thanks. It's very, when my brother and I took over, there was a lot of conversations about what we wanted stuff to look like. Obviously, as a second generation, you need to think hard about what a second generation versus a first generation is. And all the non-negotiables were how we treat people. And so I got to do one of my TEDx talks about that and how we center people and how it's totally possible to hold people and profit in a tension line. It's a choice not to, in a way. 'Cause it's difficult and it's hard and, there's weeks I haven't slept because there's been big questions and, all of that, but I just can't, I don't know, I've been in a lot of leadership positions in my life and I can't imagine not understanding fundamentally that the people in front of you are people. It's really, and honestly, I understand psychologically, I can do all the academic answers, but emotionally it is baffling to me as to how you could make those choices.
Absolutely. I mean, this value just seems to permeate through you. How do you feel like in your relationships you mentioned with your friends, shifting it to intimate relationships, do you find, you said you met your husband in Northern Ireland. Is this a value you share, both of you? Is this idea of just centering people, not just each other, but people around you? Because I know, it's always they always say you go on a date with someone and look how people treat the server. They might be really nice to you and then really disrespectful or unkind to the restaurant server. Do you find that this is at the center or heart of what your relationship is with your husband?
Oh, it's certainly a part of it. Yeah. When we first started dating, I voluntold him for a couple things that were important to me, and just watched how he responded to that. And very quickly, he became the big brother to all of my friends. and was very clear. And like I was among students, like I was living in students. But he was like an actual full adult. And so, he had his own apartment in North Belfast, and he would have all of my friends over, and like make dinner and like have us there and be there because he knew we had hard exams or it was a stressful test or like whatnot. And then after we got married, I remember we hosted 2 American Thanksgivings. And he still talks about it as one of the favorite things we've ever done in our marriage. Is the rule was, if you are an American and you do not have a home, you have one with us on that day, bring a dish to share, and that's it. And we took care of the turkey. You brought everything else. So that's what you handled. And hospitality is such a core part of what that looks like, of what centering other people looks like, radical, inclusive hospitality. And that is definitely a part of how he sees the world and moves through the world that I think has grown more. It isn't part of some of his life. He grew up in the Troubles, and so there's some nuances there that we've worked through and continue to. But it's like when we exposed him to it, it was like a sponge. Like he just got really, really excited. And now, I mean, a huge part of our lives is being available for anyone that needs us, and that's kind of, I think, how he would articulate that. But yeah, even like my other, my 2 best friends, I refer to as my other covenantal relationships. Like I've made just as many covenants with them as I have with him. And the idea of other people being centered and treated well, and respect, that every human being has dignity and respect and deserves respect. Those are at the center of those relationships too.
What is your faith that you keep referring to, if you don't mind talking about it?
Yeah, I Protestant flavor of Christianity. I grew up a little bit in evangelicalism, which has shaped me significantly. I am not that anymore, but 2 of my degrees are faith-based, and I have been in professional Christian capacities. I was for about 15 years.
Wow. So again, I'm like I love this idea of kind of the centering people, right? Because it seems like kind of in some ways like an cognitively easy principle to say, yes, I'm going to do that, but like how it shows up, right? And yeah, I love this idea of radical inclusive hospitality. Are there things that you and your husband do for each other that reflects this kind of centering each other?
Oh man, where to start? I always have room to grow in this. I know he would say I don't, but I do. What he does for me, I have excessive chronic pain and have a kind of a weird broken back thing. So laundry is really hard for me, and cooking is really hard for me, and a lot of other things like that. And so he just does them, and has our whole relationship. He just does them, and is very careful to not make me feel bad or ashamed or anything about them. I still carry a lot of the gender role nonsense in my body that feels like I should be able to be doing all these things. And he just keeps reminding me that that's not my job in our relationship. My job is other things. So I think the way that I try to center him as best I can is to be aware of that I am almost his only support system here. And that working from home makes friendships really difficult. And so he hasn't gotten to build a robust network like he had in some other phases of his life. Mm-hmm. And his whole immediate family is still in Northern Ireland and Ireland. And so I am very aware that that in some other relationships, you might leave your partner to manage some things themselves. Or expect someone else in their life to manage that for them or manage that with them. My husband doesn't have that option all the time. And so making myself available in a way that helps center him back to himself and bring him back to himself on days where he has spun a little bit away.
Well, and I imagine like you've got to understand that either going home for him, like, right, instead of like, oh, let's take a different vacation every year, like going home, like that he needs to go back and see his family either by himself or with you, and that you prioritize that, like making sure that he has the things that he needs.
For sure. And we're both neurospicy. And so there's a lot in that. And yeah, he's actually just booked a ticket home for January. He's going to go spend a week with his family. in January, and it's not one that I can join him for. So he will be delighted to have more time over there than I would be able to give. So, and that's always good. Yeah. And it's all tiny. I mean, like I learned Formula One for him, and I hate the sound of cars going around in circles. It's like nails on chalkboards. But I watch it with him. It's important to him. It's really important to him that I do that. So I do. So I know all the drivers and all the drama and all the everything and tire pressures and all this.
And you
stuff.
watch it for the crash, man, for the crashes. That's your
watch
reward.
It very much. I think the crashes are more NASCAR. There really aren't that many crashes in Formula One, but I watch it because he wants to talk about it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like you make that intentional effort? Like, obviously, I mean, how do you feel like that's a burden at all to you to be that intentional? Or do you think because you both are intentional, it's less of a burden and more of like a joy?
I mean, is anything all the time? So like, there's definitely situations where it feels annoying and I wish I didn't have to do it. And I wish I could be selfish and I wish I could do all those things.
Spoken like a true PhD, just by the way. Like, only I was married to a psychologist. That's the kind of thing she would say.
Yeah, our clients get annoyed when we're like, well, it depends. And they're
Right.
like, you can't say that. And I'm like, but it's true.
Exactly. It can be both at the same time.
Be both.
Like,
Two things can be true at once.
But also to admit to this like desire, right? Like most people wouldn't say that. Yeah, I'd like to be selfish or whatever. I think that's a very psychologist thing to say. Go on. Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's your podcast. You get to say what you want. I think that, so a big piece of this for us is that we have no kids and no pets and no plants. So we don't keep anything alive but ourselves and each other. And that changes all of our dynamics. And so at night, sometimes the decision is not who's going to put the kids to bed. The decision is who gets the big TV for the video games. Mm-hmm. And like, that's a real different dynamic. Mm-hmm. So, you know, most of the stuff I want to be selfish about is petty. It's not like really life important stuff. Mm-hmm. It's that kind of thing. I think I am I mean, it's 13 years that we've been doing this. It'll be 14 in February. I think like I'm just attuned to him in a lot of ways, and there's ways it's not conscious at all. And we got married very quickly because of some legal stuff that was happening with my visa and being able to stay there. So we fast forwarded some of the beginning stuff. And so the first like bunch of our marriage was still learning each other in a like even more significantly than I hear from other people. And everything to me just kept coming back to the fact that he was kind. Like he's just fundamentally kind. And I know what that looks like in his life and I want to support that. And he feels the same about me. So it was a lot of choices. It's still a lot of choices, but I would say, 7-8 times out of 10, we just know.
Wow. So what do you do? What would your advice be then to like our listeners out there that say, I want this. I want to be centered and I want to center my partner, but we're not there. What are there strategies, things that people can do to maybe move towards this kind of like ideal?
Yeah. Therapy. Knowing yourself really well is where it starts, and as well as you can. And because then that gives you, like Tracy, the story you were talking about pickleball earlier, like it was interesting because, you took responsibility for why you needed the thing to happen. And that guy imposed his will upon her. And that's a completely different thing. If he had been able to say, I don't like compliments, please don't give them to me, maybe it would be awkward, but that would have been relationally appropriate. And that's the kinds of things that are important in relationships. It sounds, I'm sure I sound like a lot of this is easy. We got married later. I was 30 when I got married and I already had 2 master's degrees under my belt where one of them literally graded on me on how good of a listener I was. So I've done a lot of this work just in my own self. And so I was able to, and am able, I will admit, much more easily than a lot of people I know, shift quickly into analysis of what is happening without feeling like I have to center myself in the moment. Like even if there's fighting, I try to think, like even if we're in conflict, I'm like, okay, what does he need right now? And how do I get us out of emotions and back into logic? Because nothing can be built entirely on emotions. And so how do I get us back into a place where we can build something from this and make concrete decisions? And that's not a thought process a lot of folks have, but I got that from a lot of years of therapy and a good chunk of years of social work school. And some other things like that. But therapy is hard and exclusionary and expensive and a lot of those things. So all joking aside, figure out what makes you feel loved and wanted. Figure out what makes you feel like that's not true. And then figure out ways to explain that doesn't blame the other person for not doing it. That's my advice.
See, and that's great. I mean, and we talk about therapy all the time. I'm like a big proponent of therapy, and I didn't really like do proper therapy until I was much older, like 47. And that was after being married to a psychologist who, rightfully pointed out that like I was unprocessed. All my trauma was unprocessed. And as she said it, I vomited it all over everybody. And so like I see that now in others, right? And so, yes, I did probably spend quite a bit of money on therapy. I use insurance also, but honestly, it's the best money I've ever spent. And it really does change your perspective on life, but it also makes it, you really kind of require that in the other person. I don't know if you got particularly lucky and met somebody, or you like went out seeking them. You took your list and got online and posted your list first and said only people who meet these qualifications apply.
Only processed people.
No.
Yeah.
Oh no, John, my husband is entirely unprocessed. He is entirely unprocessed. And he knows it. Like this isn't a secret. Like he is and when I talk about some of this stuff, sometimes they'll be like, you have a really strong marriage. And I was like, well, some of it helps that I academically knew his communal trauma. So like I spent years teaching the Troubles and like spent years explaining Northern Ireland. And so some of that helps is that I can quickly identify some of his triggers and reactions as something I see in a lot of other people from where he's from. Mm-hmm. But no, he got the jackpot in me in terms of processed trauma. And we did meet online. But it's a lot of, I don't know. I really, really like people who make me feel like they can make me smarter, and that's what he does. And we just kind of went from there.
Wow. So in that sense, you're very processed in some ways, or it seems as though you are, and you're admitting that maybe your husband isn't quite as much, but you have found other ways to thrive. And so Tracy and I spend a lot of time talking about how the more processed we become, the more difficult it is for us to create authentic connections with other people that aren't processed, because we notice it so much, and they drag their trauma and their drama, and there's a lot going on, and it becomes exhausting, not just in dating, but like in just friendships or even co-working relationships. It's like, oh my gosh, you got a lot going on. And so like, how would you, think about if we have listeners on here that, when we talk to people all the time, it's like, there's someone who does a ton of self-worth. They're really processing. They're maybe going to therapy. They're doing all of this stuff. And then they're with a partner who doesn't really have any interest in doing any of that at all. What kinds of maybe thoughts or advice or suggestions might you provide?
Man, first of all, it's hard. Anytime you're with somebody whose value systems are different, that's really hard. One thing I would say is there is a difference between somebody who loves that you're doing this work for you and supports you in it, and somebody who thinks you're ridiculous and is wasting their time and money. Those are two very, very different things. And for me, the first one represents a continual commitment to some sort of relational growth, and the second one does not. In terms of being in that space with somebody who is choosing not to, but celebrates that you are doing it. Not one person is never your entire world and could never be your entire emotional health and should never be anything else. And so, for example, right now I am in multiple kinds of therapy for a particular situation that is happening in my life. I'm collecting therapists like infinity stones at this point. And my husband is not going to therapy. He is delighted that I am doing this. He is so supportive. He asks what I need after every single session. He knows that I need different things after the different therapists. I'll sometimes say to them, can you help me tell him what I need? And I'll read it off a piece of paper, and he will take the piece of paper and put it in his pocket. Like he is in this. He knows why he's not interested in doing it for himself. He does not think that I am a broken toy for doing it for me. And he is very proud of me for pursuing this, not only for him, not only for me, but for us. And he's very, very proud of that. So I feel very supported, and I feel very, very valued. I have friends that are the same way. They check in with me. They know what's going on. I do all of that. So I think that feels different to me than some other ways. We have all been in those circumstances where people try to trauma bond with us or vomit their stuff all over us. Some of it's like, you're drunk in a bathroom, but some of it is much more like, in a bathroom at a dance club. But some of it is much more profound. Some of it is with a friend or with something. And so first of all, to remember that you are the one in charge of you. If you don't want to be in a relationship, and it's within the realm of possibility, you get to define your participation in any relationship. That's your choice. In terms of tips for how to navigate with people, you can decide what questions you're going to ask them and which ones you're not. You can decide what events in their life you might show up to and which ones you won't. You can figure out what kind of white lies you want to dance around to explain why you aren't there. You can do a lot of that stuff. And that will be to varying degrees of success or not. To be the PhD sociologist person, you can't control them at all. So if they're worth it, put in the work to make it worth it, I guess. And you can draw your own boundaries. We've talked about boundaries this time, like, hey, I really want to do this, but I can't talk about this with you. Or this is not something that we're going to talk about. Lots of people do that with lots of different things. I have one of my absolute platonic soulmates in the whole world. There's a good core chunk of stuff we know we don't agree on, and so we just don't talk about it. And that's a reality of a lot of relationships. Just because you believe that somebody is a human and you respect them, that they are people, you might not respect them. You might not agree with them. You might not want to do anything with them ever again. But seeking to understand and center their humanity is the place to start. And that helps you make an informed decision.
Yeah, I like that. I like this idea of don't have to necessarily agree with them, but, centering their humanity it does make you look at things differently, especially in this era where there's a lot of tension and a lot of family dynamics and things that are going on where people they're seeing a very big clash in values, and figuring out how do you center the human while also maintaining your values, beliefs, and ability to disagree, versus saying this isn't someone that I necessarily want to spend time with. My boundary is that this isn't healthy for me, and trying to figure out how to navigate between those two, right? What is unhealthy for me and something I don't want to be in, and something where I disagree with someone, yet I still care about them and want them in my life.
Yeah, I think the quickest way to continue to sow conflict is to dehumanize people. If you look at the history of genocides in particular, the party of power that wants to eliminate another group of people will start using very dehumanizing language for that group of people. You have to get a group of people to believe that somebody else isn't a human. And then it becomes very easy. We see this in the language that slave owners used for slaves here in the United States. We see it in the language that the United States government used about indigenous people when they gathered them up and sent them to schools. We see this consistently. You have to dehumanize somebody. And we, as people, do it all the time when we are encouraged to think about other people as evil.
Well, we're seeing it now a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And it's born out of pain, or it's born out of frustration, or it's born out of anger, all of those things. It's born out of grief a lot, I think. But from my perspective, both from like lived experience and from the research I've done, is all it does is create like holes in us. And it takes away our own humanity to start accusing others of not being human. And it might be a lot more mental work, especially at the beginning, but it's a lot better for our stress cycles and our blood pressure and our nervous system to not assume that the guy that cut you off in traffic is actively evil. Like we gotta regulate ourselves here in terms of emotions. And if we can say that person is a human, I never want to experience them, I never want to know them, I think their beliefs and their actions are abhorrent, they're a person, and we're done. That's healthy, I think.
Okay, this is interesting because there's some levels, right? And we're experiencing in the United States now with the talking about, people who have left their home countries to try to seek a better life as trash and murderers and rapists and all that, which in my opinion is immoral. And I've done post-genocidal work and worked in Cambodia. So I know that very familiarly. And yet, and to then say, okay, well, like somebody cuts you off or something does something terrible out in the world or, in the pickleball court and all that. And then you go to a relationship. And I think like for me, I just want to clarify to everyone when I said my ex-wife said I vomited all over everybody. It was never drunk vomiting. It was simply like unprocessed trauma of me like storming out and being reactionary all the time. And I've totally changed that. But like, I think that you look at a relationship, an intimate relationship, and look at that person. We had a whole podcast about that, like with the assume that they have the best intentions or don't always. I used to be the person who assumed that everybody's intentions were terrible. And I was a cop and I did grow up in an abusive home and I have a lot of my own stuff. Right. And so for me, getting into a relationship, it was all about I was literally like, I felt like I was with an enemy. And I never understood that until I read, this whole book on it and all that. And so I totally, completely changed my perspective and my thought on relationships. And I think that is a thing for a lot of people to understand that when you are like, this whole season's about thriving in relationships. And when we started, I said, I never have thrived in a relationship, but I could thrive in one going forward, right? Only with all of this awareness and then finding somebody who's equally committed to that. And that's where I think like, if you're going to stay in a relationship, if you're going to continue to abuse someone, you've got to like give them you need to see them realistically. Because I do think there are some people that are just bad. And I am a, divorce attorney. So I do see a lot of really awful, awful things that people do. But that like generally absent abuse and all this kind of stuff, like people are trying to do the best they can. And people are like, if you would just give them the benefit of the doubt when they upset you and be able to communicate. But I feel like that's the biggest breakdown, right? So not only do you have this lack of understanding of another person, which you seem to have mastered, is like, I would say you've mastered it. You just made a face there. Podcast listeners can't see. But I mean, if any human has mastered it, right? Like, I mean, you literally talked about you're interested in this from the time you're 7. Most kids are not interested in that, right? So like clearly this has been your life's work to understand other people, to try to bring people together. And, whether that be in a relationship, in a community, in a, you can like go from the micro to the macro. And so I think that's the thing that everyone has to hold in their mind, right? Is that the other person who you're engaged in a relationship with isn't trying to hurt you, but that they have something, absent abuse, that like, it's just a different perspective. So I had someone get mad at me and hang up on me yesterday because I said I didn't want extra things for Thanksgiving. And it's just because I don't eat. I don't care. Could care less about food. It's going to be at 5:00 in the evening. I'm making some sandwiches. And I didn't want all this extra stuff. But that person perceived me as being rude and short and like dismissive and didn't give me the opportunity to explain, right? And just bam, hung up. And so then like a series of texts. And I think it's really hard, like to when you're in the heat of the moment or you're upset or your butt hurt, like calm down and ask that person, like, what did you really mean by that? Or what, I mean, we have so many podcasts on this, like communication is so hard for people.
Yeah, and I think when you've gotten to a point in a relationship where you are actually trying to hurt the other person, that's the goal. Because
Right.
there are a lot of people like that aren't abusive or the other categories of people that they need some sense of control in their lives, and they'll lash out and do that with their partner and verbally, kind of attack them. If that's a situation that's happening, that is a situation like you don't necessarily like you need to double check that you have to be in. And because it's just real hard or there's work to be done. So the other thing about communication that I'll say is that one of the biggest revelations for me in another intimate relationship that I was in is that saying, like, what do you mean by that was not nearly as helpful as this is what I heard. Is this what you said? And like that has been for me personally, like friendships, business relationships, clients, like everybody. Here's what I just heard. Is that what you said? And then more than 90% of the time, they say, no, not at all. And then we can actually sit there and clarify what we want. And the 10% that I was right, I'm like, okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Right.
And I know that now and I can make decisions. I'm a really big fan of evidence-based choices. So I gather as much data as I can and then I make my decision. But yeah, communication is hard. It's evolutionary too. You're going to communicate to people differently in different seasons of your life. It's work. It's practice. No one is truly excellent at it, no matter what, somebody on a podcast tells you. Just kidding. But it's weird and hard, and humans don't know what they feel every day. And like there's a line from the Mean Girls musical we use all the time, which is that's a feeling, not a fact. And so often in relationships, conflicts are based on feelings and the other person thinks they're based on facts or vice versa. And so figuring out, again, like how to breathe, how to calm our nervous system, when to know you just need a minute and like walk away. All of those things are key to then saying like, okay, what just happened? Where do we go from here? What just happened? And it's a dance. It's a dance, and everybody's got different ways, and you just try to mash something together sometimes.
Yeah. It is, and it's tricky, and I love that. That's a feeling, not a fact. I too am a researcher, and I love my empirical evidence, in that sense. But I also want to kind of shift a little bit of gears here too, because I know you've done some work on understanding burnout, and you wrote a book called The Culture of Burnout, and wanted to see if you could share a little bit too, because not just like, we want to hear what is burnout, how are you defining burnout, but really this idea of how does an individual's partner's feeling of burnout maybe come into and affect a relationship. If you're with somebody who's just so burned out in their job and they're just so overwhelmed, how might that impact the relationship? Or even in the relationship, you're feeling just burned out in the relationship. We go through these seasons. I've been in many long-term relationships where it's like things are fine in your partner's life, and then they're just so exhausted, something they're burned out and they're bringing it home. And so maybe you could just kind of give us your take on burnout and maybe how it impacts relationships too.
Sure. Burnout is a physiological reaction in both your body and your brain to you being in a high state of stress for a long period of time, which basically means you've never completed the stress cycle. The stress cycle is a whole delightful system of chemicals and hormones and all this stuff that when something stressful is about to happen, your body kicks that into overdrive. It kicks it into overdrive. The same chemicals are out for the photocopier is a problem. I'm in a fight with somebody, or there's a tiger about to eat me. It's the same bodily functional reaction. Mm-hmm. What is important after that, and this is the fight, flight, or freeze sometimes, but most of us don't even feel that fight, flight, or freeze because we just constantly live in this state of a heightened stress cycle that we never complete. And the way to complete it is to move your body. That's it. So you have like a really big meeting that's super stressful and you're really overwhelmed. Get up from your desk and walk around and breathe. You are in a fight with your partner. Get up and move. Like, this is important to send signals to our body that we are not actually in physical danger. So, when you're in burnout, it is that forever. It's like that, I joke a lot when we teach this, that a lot of us in the United States have been in burnout since elementary school. And that, women in particular, tend to be in burnout in longer periods of time simply because of the cultural expectations put upon us in different ways. So then what burnout, first of all, can happen anywhere. As Corey just said, a lot of the definitions you'll see around the tinternets will tell you it only happens at work, and we think that's garbage. It can happen in a caregiving relationship. It can happen where you're volunteering. It can happen in your partnership. It can happen. So it happens wherever it happens. And what's different sometimes between depression and burnout, I get this question a lot, is that depression is not situational. You've generally, it's not like I only feel sad, or I only feel too exhausted to move, or I only feel overwhelmed by this one thing, whatever your depression feels like to you. It's everything. It's your whole life. It's drowning everywhere. And burnout does not have to be like that. Burnout can be, I'm drowning at work, and when I get home, it's my happy place, and I get to just be, and I'm not burned out there. And the reason we know this in particular is because of the research on men and women in burnout. And we hear all the time, and I co-wrote the book with Erin. And so we did the research together and we wrote it together. And then we recorded the audiobook together, which was super fun. But what we discovered is that even though people say all the time that men don't burn out, that's not true at all. They burn out at home because they've been enculturated and raised to succeed at work. Flip side, it looks like women burn out a lot more because they burn out at work because they've been culturally entrenched and programmed to thrive at home. So what does burnout look like in men? It might look like someone coming home and zoning out in the recliner for 4 hours and not helping with put the kids to bed. It could look like somebody only watching football for 12 and a half hours every Saturday, and they have to do that, and they won't engage with the rest of the family. It can look like a lot like escapism. It can look like a lot of the jokes we make about people. It can look like only getting excited about their golf game, only getting excited about the band they're in, only getting excited about this. It can look like, but he doesn't really know my kids. He doesn't really know our kids. He's not invested in our kids. It can look like, well, all she cares about is her job. It can look like, it can look like a lot of different things. But it tends to happen in the opposite place that you are culturally programmed to thrive. We cannot find any research on non-binary folks. We wish we could. We can't find any research on trans folks. And if anything of a transition changes any of those dynamics, we can't find the research. We hope someone does it soon. But what we do have the research is on the binary. And this is how the binary interacts with each other. And it's definitely in almost every Western country that we've collected data, even in ones with slightly more equal gender roles. It's still getting unpackaged there so much that we still see that. So what it looks like in a partner relationship, a marriage, I think what I would say more than anything, because again, everyone hates this. It depends. But more than anything, it really feels like a lack of connection. Because what burnout is marked by is a sense of cynicism, of emotional retreat, of completely disconnection. Because burnout is all of those things, but what it really is a decrease of your emotional capacity to handle stuff. imagine a scale, and the more you don't finish the stress cycle, the more that the more it just weighs and weighs and weighs and weighs. And finally, when it's time to do something you like, you have maybe 4% of room. And without a lot of work and consistent help, maybe even some medical or psychiatric intervention, you can't get that thing open again. So the more you are in the stress cycle, the more you don't break out of it, the more you don't do any of that, the shorter your emotional capacity. So in the book, we explored why that is, why it's particularly weird in America, and what we do about it. And so that's kind of where we're at with that.
See,
Wow.
again, therapy, communication, like understanding all of that, like will go to help. I don't know if that's what you're thinking, Corey, about burnout, but I mean, in a relationship, I mean, both people have to decide to be in it, right? And even when you have a lot of life stressors, you've got to understand what the other person's going through and be willing to be helpful in a way that's helpful to that other person. Not in the way that you think you should be helpful, but in the way that actually will help the other person. But I do think there are, like, we talk about thriving. I mean, this whole thing is about thriving in a relationship, but there are just times where it's time to go. It's time to jet. It's time to leave. And it's time to say, okay, this ran its course, or it's no longer serving the person, right? Like, I mean, there is you and then there's your relationship. Like, do you have that opinion, like, as much as communal stuff that you do and all that, like, how important is the individual?
Oh, I mean, if you're not minding yourself, then the relationship cannot mind you for you. So like there are seasons where like you can't, maybe there's been seasons in my life where I can't, but I've communicated that and said, I need more right now. Mm-hmm. But no, I'm not somebody who thinks that all relationships are for all time. I do there are relationships that will break me in half if they ever end. And there are ones that they didn't text back. Oh, well. So and you can know it's time to leave in any level of relationship. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it requires more strategy, and sometimes it's as easy as not returning texts. Mm-hmm. And 6 months later, just going, oh, I haven't heard from them in a while. Okay. It's you get to leave. You get to leave. You are an agent of your own life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think about when you're talking about that, and going back to this idea of burnout, there are some people that almost live in a perpetual state of burnout. If they're not burned out about work, they're burned out about home, or they're burned out about so many things. Yeah. And, and I've seen this, I haven't been in a partnership like this, but I have seen other people where their partner is just burned out perpetually. Mm-hmm. And it just drains the relationship because the other person is like, listen, I don't have any opportunity to feel stressed or burned out because I am so busy giving to you in your consistent state of this. And hoping that person will make life choices like, okay, you've been complaining about your job. You hated your job for 14 years. Like you need to leave your job or stop complaining or something. I don't know if I have the emotional capacity to continue to be that person to support you.
Or complain about it elsewhere. Maybe they just like to complain.
Maybe they do, but
the person hearing it can't take it.
But it's just like you get to a point where you're like, I'm not sure that I can give 90% and you can give 10%. I get it in relationships where it fluctuates. People are going through things. But, what are your thoughts on that kind of perpetual state of burnout? And Tracy's question is like, is that, I mean, everybody has the right and the reason to leave for whatever, but just, is that something that you've seen before where people are like, I just don't want to live in this kind of state any longer?
Well, yeah, I mean, they wouldn't necessarily call it from burnout necessarily. Right. I think a lot of our burnout work is not centered within relationships. So I haven't seen as much data around that. We do it much more socially, much more like 30,000 foot view kind of thing, what it looks like around. But I would say at a certain point when you are educated about what burnout is and you start saying things like, I'm so burned out, but I can't do anything about it, then that really becomes a choice. And there are things to do about it. There are lots of things to do about it. And they might be scary and they might be overwhelming and they might require some significant life changes, but it's possible. We argue that the American dream is not possible without burnout. You cannot be successful in this country without it. either your burnout or someone else's. And that traces back to the 1600s. It's baked into what it means to be an American. And then we spend a third of our book explaining what to do about it. It's not a death sentence. It's not an inevitability in the way that people use it as an excuse for being afraid to change sometimes. And so I also am a huge fan of I'm not this person for you. I've set that boundary so many times of I can't do this. I need you to find somebody else. If it's a wall or a therapist, I don't care, but I am not your person. I've very much looked at the people I've been in relationships with and said, I am not your personal social worker. Like, you have got to find somebody else. And I will say, in all of those relationships, it was weird for a little bit, and then it became okay. Mm-hmm. And it, the boundary, there's a difference between a listening ear and a supportive spouse, and a spouse or a partner that has been turned into a therapist, an untrained, unskilled, unavailable therapist. And so we still, have that boundary with a person, and they'll start in, and I'll say, okay, so when's your next appointment?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep.
But even being married to a therapist, it's not the therapist's responsibility to fix you. I mean, I'm talking about me in particular, like having been married to a therapist and then having to do therapy outside of the relationship,
it's not fair to your friends either.
Right.
Like, it's not fair to, like, I get a lot of people like emotional disclosures. I have either that face or that vibe. I don't know. I get it from strangers. I got it at Disney World this weekend. Like, from somebody online.
I get all that too. Corey doesn't understand it.
Tracy gets it all the time too.
I get it. I'm just like, bring it in.
Why do they tell you all this stuff?
I like it.
The same people. We interact with the same people. I'm like, why do they tell you all this stuff? And I'm like, they don't tell me this stuff. And I'm like, but that's because I've been very clear about my boundaries.
No, I'm like, bring it on.
It doesn't bother me. Like sometimes is strong. But it doesn't bother me ever, really, truly. Like, I don't ever feel like it's carrying something because it's a stranger. So I just put it down as soon as I can. But there have been times where friends have said things that I wish I didn't know. And I didn't ask to be told everything I was told. And they needed a safe space, and they thought I was that space, and that's an honor. But all of that should have gone to a professional and not me. And so I think, there's a double-edged sword to like everyone knowing therapy speak. Like, I'm glad we can have these conversations, but the other side of it is that people throw around words they don't know what they mean, and they throw around words really cheaply. And one of them, honestly, is burnout. People throw that around a lot, especially younger generations. We have found like it's an Instagram hashtag, so it gets thrown around a lot. And I think sometimes in relationships we can use language with each other that we don't actually know what it means. We just saw it like on Grey's Anatomy or something, and so we just we don't do the work that we need to do on us or elsewhere. And it just kind of gets weird. It gets weird. So the best thing, like the other thing I would say to that is if you are somebody that is in the position of receiving everything all the time, find somewhere to put it yourself. And
I do. I put it on the pickleball court.
Yeah. Physical activity is a huge one. Like I'm, like I said, chronic pain. It's really hard for me to move. So I get it out in video games. Like I kill a lot of dragons. Like that's a real big thing for me. So you find a way to exude it out of you. Just because they gave you something does not mean you have to carry it. So
exactly.
Put it down
I like that.
Exactly.
Like
you can hear it, you can take it, but I think, and that's also, people have totally different skill sets in that. And I know somebody who doesn't want to hear other people's stuff. And I'm like, it's like it comes here, but it doesn't stick to me. And it's like, okay, I know it, bye. But I just want to say before we close, I'd like to clone you, a lot of you. And like more people should listen to you and be like you. I mean, you're very, very thoughtful. And if you ever have a vegan commune, I'd like to live there. But it's like your intentionality is very admirable. You should be very proud of yourself. And, it's like you didn't have to be this way or this caring about other people. And it's very refreshing to see that. And the thoughtfulness that you have for everything is, and the thought for other people. And, you've mentioned social work degree and therapy and all that. And, I lived in a country in Cambodia, where they brought in one social worker to start a social work school, and living in Southeast Asia, where it's not about social work. It's not about concern about others. Do you have a strong man who can protect you, right? So to try and bring in social work, to actually live in a society that doesn't have a social worker like foundation like we do in the US, which seems to have eroded or gone out of people's minds completely. Like, this is super, super important. So I appreciate your work on the micro, macro levels. It makes a big difference,
Oh, thank you. I'm horrible with compliments, but thank you so much. That was very kind and very generous.
Well, I take it back.
No, I mean, I echo the sentiment. I think it's really important. I think a lot of people, particularly right now, are feeling really down and feel like a lack of respect, or feel they're questioning humanity's intentions. There's a lot of things going on right now. And, and I continue to just, reiterate this idea that, kindness and respect and looking at kind of the best in others and being there for people is really, that's what we can offer. Like, that's how we can show up. And, so this was a very timely episode. And so, Kristen, thank you for being on. Maybe before we wrap up, you can tell us, you've got your book. It sounds like you've got your TED Talk. We can put all of that in the show notes. Is there anything that you want to share that is like a future initiative you're doing, and maybe how people can learn more about you or follow you or your work and that kind of thing?
Well, if you head to cultureofburnout.com, you'll see a way to get on our newsletter. And that's the best way to get in touch with us. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. That's the only place I hang out. The rest of visual social media is toxic for my soul. So we are not there. But we're working future projects. Erin and I are working on our next book, which is going to be about the evolution of belonging throughout generations and what it means to belong and how technology has or has not played into that. There'll be a brief book first about the kind of how that applies to a workplace, and then we'll kind of go full nerd. And the joking working title is right now is I think it's like chair printing press TikTok, how everything has changed. So we're kind of going in that direction, but it's all in pencil, so it could change tomorrow. But yeah, if you head to cultureofburnout.com, join our newsletter there, you'll hear more about what's going on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. Like I said, what a refreshing conversation, how I feel inspired and really glad that you're here. And, and I think there were so many great takeaways for our listeners on, we kind of covered a range of things. They all really centered around the idea of centering other people and really paying attention to what our needs are, being able to express those, but being able to make sure that we're respectful and supportive of others. And so for all of our listeners out there, until our next episode, go out there and rock those relationships. If you liked what you heard, check out our show notes for resources from today's episode. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram under Rock That Relationship, and go to our website at rockthatrelationship.com for updated episodes and more great information.
Thanks for listening. Now go rock those relationships.